Hi, my name's Sally Lombardo. I'm a member of St. Michael's Episcopal, and I'm here to teach and encourage about the early church and to explain how the church was born. I have a master's in divinity from Truett Seminary, and since that time, my passion and interest has been the early church itself and the history behind that, the beautiful flow of the church through the many years up to now, and especially the women who were instrumental in founding that church, and as I believe were completely key in propelling the church forward, housing and holding and sheltering it until it could be born. Now, I've just recently written a book, and it is due to be published sometime in the fall, and I've titled it A Midwife Looks at the Birth of the Church, because for many years I worked as a home birth midwife and a doula, which is I continue to do now, and have been with many women through pregnancy and birth, and enjoyed their many stories of courage and fortitude and resilience in the middle of pain and pressure and fear. And I began to see how much this was like the birth of the church that I had studied in seminary. So I decided I would write about that. My book explores really the book of Acts largely, but beginning with the Gospels and the women involved in that, and then on through the book of Acts and in Paul's writings, Corinthians and Romans, as we'll discuss in detail. But it's really about the church, how the church was born with, amidst a lot of fear, persecution, triumph, and pain, with courage, and that it was really Jesus' death and resurrection that gave people the motivation to begin this new Christian era. And the followers banded together in what they called ecclesia, the Greek word for church, which also meant gathering, bonding, grouping, and as we'll study, another beautiful Greek word, koinonia, which meant fellowship. And these two words kind of became synonymous for the beginnings of church. Early on, as I introduce my philosophy for writing, I explore the fact that Luke, as writer of the Gospel and presumed writer of the book of Acts, begins both books with the story of a birth. He talks about the birth of Jesus in detail in Luke 2, which we're all quite familiar with. And then in Acts, he depicts the birth of the Christian church through the coming of the Spirit at Pentecost. And as I begin to see this parallel, I thought that there's something about the birth of anything new that can teach us, train us, encourage us. And both are really eruptions of new life. And in the Bible, they are the witness of the power of the Holy Spirit, something I think that we can learn from and continue today. The early church was kept safe in these hidden Christian fellowships, and I found this so interesting as I began to explore this topic, that it was really sheltered and housed, not unlike a pregnant mother will shelter and house a baby until it's ready to be born. And so God bequeathed the responsibility of sheltering this largely to women. Men were the teachers and apostles and itinerant travelers that went around, including Paul and other apostles like him, Timothy, Silas, Mark, and they would be the ones to largely teach in the beginning and preach, and women would house the fellowships. And as we see, these grew into large home church gatherings, and then over time, women themselves would become preachers. And I think that many people don't know this story, and I find it quite interesting for us to be able to study this and learn for our own lives today. So in my book, I explore 7 relatively unknown women. I begin with Mary Magdalene, and then I will explore several other Marys in the Gospels and in the beginning of Acts. That was quite a common name, but each Mary is designated as the mother of James and Joseph, the mother of Zebedee's sons, the mother of Jesus, the sister of Martha. They're always designated. So I'll explore them in the beginning. I moved to studying Lydia, Priscilla, Chloe, Phoebe, Nympha, and Junia. And all of these women were women who offered or began home churches and they would be followed lovingly. And these women worked in their own ways to become pivotal in changing history for us and Christian history that would follow. So there are really few texts that examine these very brave women, and I decided that that would be something that I could offer to both women and men in this era of a time when women are being challenged and noticed and are using a lot of different ways to gain notoriety, some of which are not always positive and good. I believe fully that God has gifted women with certain traits, gifts, spiritual gifts, and talents, and that we can witness those as being used through the Bible mightily, and that we should use ours today. And I teach about women that Jesus called these different women, and in the Bible they're termed certain women, which is quite unique. And he trained these women and called them the ones who birthed and sheltered and raised the church, and he's calling us today. And in the questions that will follow, I'll help you explore this. How is he calling you? And what is your purpose? And what can you offer today in the simple way of calling forth your own bravery and courage and strength to begin something new? So I'll begin with the metaphor of birth, which is what I love to use and talk about. So does the miracle of human birth, even Mary's birth of Jesus, have a similarity to the miraculous birth of the early church? And I'll punctuate my text with different birth stories, and in my book you can really follow some of those and enjoy them. And in here I'll just pepper it with a few of those. But I really discovered that there is a great likeness between giving birth and then giving birth to new things in life that bring great reward. Many people are reluctant to follow their calling with courage and give birth to new things, and this work is an effort to change that course. I spent 4 years in seminary learning about the history of the church, and I began to believe in these different women who I saw were midwives to the gospel. I'll begin with the woman Mary Magdalene, who is somewhat explored, and different traditions will explain her differently, but I'll come from a historical view of what her life and ministry might have been like. She is a person who initiated the course of walking a path toward purpose and freedom that many did not follow in her day and could not. She is an example for us of a person who did not miss her calling, and I think that she's a wonderful example today. I had a childbirth student named Casey. She was really my first childbirth student, who was very young, and she was not married and struggled with whether to keep her baby or not, and God gave us both the opportunity to become friends, and I watched her grow from a very timid girl to a bold witness. I watched her become a Christian during her pregnancy. I watched her develop courage like I'd never seen, keep her baby. It was a beautiful birth that we had together with her mother and best friend present. And she went on to become a midwife herself and have several more children at home and become a wonderful example to many. So in the same way, these early Christians were bold witnesses for Christ who decided to keep what they had learned about this Jesus and to shelter it and send it forth. And in the early church, these women were taught to be brave and to be apologists for the cause of Christ. They were probably better apologists than we are today. And Mary Magdalene certainly gathered her own courage to follow this Jesus. And in so doing, she becomes an apologist for the cause, as we'll see at the end, where she is the one who arrives to tell the disciples in the upper room that Jesus is alive. And she explains what she's seen, and she's become a bold voice for Christ. So she is a woman who left likely everything that she had ever known. She was from the Magdala region of Galilee, which is in the northern area, and she might have heard Jesus speak at the lake of Gennesaret, where he was, the feeding of the 5,000 occurred, and where Jesus probably did several long teaching talks, the type where people would come and sit and enjoy. And she probably sneaked away to these and would stand and hear him and listen. And she made this bold decision to leave what would have at that time been a tribe or a clan of people. And as a woman, this was quite a daring move. She left probably and would have inquired with the itinerant disciples who were following Jesus all over Israel, just as we can learn when we read the Gospels themselves. And whether there were other women or not, we don't know. All we hear about is Mary Magdalene. She would have left her father and against his will, and would have left any plans he had for her to marry or for her to be a part of their clan or another clan who he would have been close to. But Mary would have followed. She is a woman who is described as sitting at the feet of Jesus, just as Mary, the sister of Martha, Mary of Bethany, is described as sitting at the feet, which is the position of a disciple. And in that day, they would have known that that meant the person was a follower or part of the inner group. And to us, we think of sitting at the feet as worshiping, which it is, but then it had another connotation as well. Mary is described in several different Gospels toward the end at the cross. And you can see, and we'll study that Mark provides a detail that Saturday evening when the Sabbath had ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome purchased spices and were there at the cross as well as going to the tomb to minister to Jesus. Matthew adds that many women who had followed Jesus from Galilee and ministered to him were also there at the tomb, among them Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Mary the mother of Zebedee's sons. And these represent the several Marys that I explore in my book. They were looking on from a distance, but then John adds that the next morning Mary Magdalene stands outside the tomb weeping, and then stoops and looked in the tomb as if anticipating Jesus to either still be there or be sitting up and talking to her, because he told them that he would rise again. And she sees the two angels in white and hears Jesus calling her name and asking, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And Mary is the one who then runs to the disciples in the place where Jesus also came. And she's frightened but ecstatic. And she is the one who they describe that it sounds like nonsense. Luke says they went to tell the apostles all the things they had seen. But Mary believed she was uniquely called to bear this good news. Why were these three simple women, these three Marys, the first to see the angels and to hear from the resurrected Christ and then receive a message from God? Well, this group of women, according to various degrees, are probably women who had traveled the countryside and followed Jesus. And so we take that for granted. We hear that and think, well, of course they followed, and they're in the Bible. But for them to follow meant something great. And would we leave our present lives to follow Jesus? And in a symbolic sense, what are we willing to give up? To follow his commands, to follow our own callings, to follow his voice, even if that means we don't know what's around the bend, but we follow daily, and day by day we follow what he tells us to do, through the word, through others, and through our own hearts. Mary is one who believed the truth about Jesus' new kingdom of God, and she accepted his explanation of a role. Interestingly, Mary, the mother of James and John, who were the sons of Zebedee, is one who approaches Jesus and asks that they sit at his right and left hand. This can be found in the book of Matthew. And he looks at her and says, "This isn't mine to give. Instead, it belongs to the one for whom it's been prepared. I can't say who will sit at my right and left hand." And we do see this Mary as well at the cross, realizing that she's had a transformation as well. Additionally, another Mary, the mother of John Mark, will house the headquarters of the Jerusalem church. And this is quite interesting to me. She obviously had the financial means to manage such a home, but her husband is not mentioned. And this will be a theme that I follow through my book. Many of these women are mentioned without a husband. And so these women are intended to be highlighted as acting alone. And we'll see the same pattern with Lydia and Phoebe, Paul's friends and co-workers who are not mentioned as having a man alongside. But this Mary offering her home is a bold and brave choice. And this is where Peter will go, and we see in the book of Acts, where after he has been jailed for speaking about Christ, he's released miraculously. Some angels come, and his chains fall off, and he's delivered, and he goes right away to the church in Mary's house. It's the first church mentioned as a headquarters in Jerusalem. So much that Peter, as the leader of the movement at that time, would go to her home, would flee there. A funny detail is that the servant girl, Rhoda, doesn't believe that it's him, and she runs away from the door without letting him in. But we can hear the others behind encouraging her and saying, let him in, it's Peter. And so he goes. Paul continues to mention other women through the work in the first century church that we will explore, and their stories are quite interesting. First, with Peter, we follow the lives of Tabitha, who he raises, and in Acts, Priscilla and Lydia and Nympha will even enliven his ministry. And then Paul will mention Phoebe, Junia, Julia, Tryphenia, as well as the mothers of Rufus and Paul. And these women will act as brave apostles alongside others. They will bear up under just as much duress as the male apostles that we have heard about for so long. Before I move to chapter 2 about the home church, I do want to give a glimpse of questions to come, which will challenge us to think about. These women had to ask themselves and ask God, how much can I bear? Can I do this, Lord? Can I defy Caesar and all the persecutions to come? Who will help me during this time? And what will this all be worth it for me to step out in faith and take on a new ministry, just as we're called to today in many ways? In chapter 2, I'll explore the idea of the home church. And this is something that many of us may have heard of, but we take it fairly for granted that women invited a group into their church and they made food and just as we do today. But it was quite a bit harder. Jesus really left no instruction for the church except to go and make disciples of all the world and baptize them into fellowship, into me, in Matthew 28. So people had to use their own ideas and to cultivate this fertile soil of the early church with their passion and charisma that would follow. But just as the book of Acts reveals, the church would grow within these different homes that were meager. Some of these homes were just dirt floors where they met in secret and huddled together. And they were modest dwellings. And then some of them would become large porticos and villas, as you can see evidence for in Ephesus, these domus dwellings that have frescoes on the walls of people gathering in the homes. In many cases, we know in these frescoes it was to worship Christ because the Christian symbols would be put on the walls. And these were cryptic symbols that the Roman Empire wouldn't have known about. As such, the drawing of half of the ichthus fish, and someone would complete the other half in the sand. And this would be the same for drawings on the wall. Women would serve as financial patrons, those who had means. And this is something that was done by people like Phoebe and Lydia, who chose on their own to provide shelter for people like Paul and Timothy and others. They overcame their fears. They waited with eagerness and joy for something they knew would fill their lives with great purpose, just as a woman who waits through a pregnancy for her birth. So what did this preparation look like? I love to look at the early church that in Acts, Jesus had given the disciples many proofs over 40 days, and then he was suddenly taken up into a cloud. And the people, you can imagine them back on earth, looking at each other thinking, what do we do now? Where do we go? And how do we start? And what was all that? What was all that about? But after a time with fairly sad countenances, they united in prayer. The book of Acts tells us they're along with the women, it says, with Mary, the mother of James, and with the brothers of Jesus, and Mary, the mother of Jesus, of course. Mother had embraced his message with a sense of transformed urgency, it seems. There's a beautiful little story about Jesus teaching in Mark, and his family goes to restrain him, saying, quote, he's out of his mind. His mother and brothers and sisters were part of this group. That Jesus had responded when questioned by the onlookers who mentioned your mother and brothers are waiting outside. He says, who are my mother and brothers? Who is my family? They who are the ones who do the will of God are my mother and sisters and brothers. So Mary, we see at the end, and there she is gathered in the upper room, that she considers herself now as one of his chosen and has fully embraced the message. The day the Spirit comes at Pentecost, the church is born in power. As we know the story, with the sound of a rushing wind, women and men alike are filled with the Spirit and begin to speak in boldness and confidence. And the church era is born. According to Luke, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to koinonia or fellowship, and to the breaking of bread and to prayers. They sold their possessions, they shared everything, and were praising God, finding favor with all the people. This is part of the latter portion of Acts 2. Among them were the women who had become loyal followers of Jesus himself. And this new band of believers becomes known as the Way of Christ. So Mary, the mother of John Mark, then, as I just mentioned, provides this first church a place of refuge. Peter comes and anoints it with his presence. And just as women who'd supported the ministry of Jesus, women would now house, shelter, and support Paul and teach for his cause. Priscilla and Lydia will be pivotal to this new growth and would change the reputation and standing of women in the Roman world. And we'll explore that, the view of the Roman woman. And was not necessarily subservient, but she was extremely isolated from the life of a man. And yet Priscilla would enter into that. Lydia, as a Roman woman herself, would defy that and change the course of what would become Christian women to follow. But they welcomed other followers of the way into their homes. They offered courtyards, homes, as places of worship, and these would become an ark, really, that would carry the church through the storm. Interestingly, the man Saul, who becomes renamed Paul in the Greek, would travel into Galatia, into Syrian Antioch, to Macedonia and the coast of Greece, and far and wide, to reach Gentiles who Jesus commissioned him to seek. But in his early days, he was set to destroy them all. What we know as the Damascus Road beautiful story is that Paul is changed and transformed, just like most of these women are changed and transformed by the ministry of the Spirit and the Lord. And Paul will commend, praise, and mention many women in his letters, Corinthians, Colossians, and Romans. And he will praise them as women of God, women who worked alongside me, women who helped me, and ask others to benefit and contribute and support them as well. So each of these women lived a dramatically different life, and these lives would soon be on display through the writings that would be gathered into what we know as the Bible. And in living out their callings, they would change and motivate the world for centuries to come. So we'll begin to explore these women as what I call in chapter 3, midwives of the gospel. In my chapter 3, I begin with a story of one of my favorite birth memories of a girl who became a very good friend, whose name is Hope. She had 3 children, completely in a natural birth, and my favorite one is her third birth, where she stayed home from the hospital, as I instructed most of my students to do, for as long as you can, to stay out of the hospital and learn to labor at home and take care of your other children and to do what you could. So she walked slowly up to the hospital door late at night. I met them there. She was big, heavy, really about to give birth. And we had to stop several times to make it through a contraction or two. She gets to the hospital door, and a nurse ran down to meet her and gave some signs that the door wouldn't work. So we had to come up with another plan. Hope pounded on the glass, but the woman still wouldn't let us in. She didn't have a wheelchair, which was protocol. She couldn't get the door to work, and nothing was quite working according to plan. So we saw a doctor pull in at 1 a.m. We followed him up to the doctor's entrance, which supposedly wasn't allowed. But Hope made her way in, past the people saying no, determinedly made it to the birthing floor, and together we gave birth to the baby. And I liken this to the early Christian women who pounded the doors of preconceived notions of what it was to be a woman in Rome and would house the early church. They were under similar pressure. They made frequent choices to defy the ruling powers. Really, the first 3 decades of the church, from the early 30s AD to the late 60s AD, consisted of underground teaching and instruction and preaching. And the intent was to spread the word and spread it quickly and with force and power. Jesus had warned his disciples that the kingdom of God would advance with the will of God, but strong men would oppose it. So small home churches and worship fellowships took place really under Roman surveillance and the threat of death. Paul would plant a church in one place, stay for several weeks or months, and then move on to another place. As we see following Paul, which is not the intent of my work, but he has such a colorful life. He was often chased out, beaten, mocked, laughed at. He had to be lowered in baskets. He had to be snuck out in the night because he became enemy number one, because he was creating a church under the power and move of the Holy Spirit. But his determination and grit helped him write letters to encourage those who had fostered the communities of Christ. And one of these will be the letter back to the Philippians, where Lydia lived, because Lydia was a resident of Philippi, which we'll see in the chapter of Lydia as we study her and come to know what it was that she uniquely did to begin this first church on European soil. But the book of Acts will offer us this detailed record of many courageous women, including Chloe, Nympha, and later Claudia, we'll see in another chapter. But Acts 16 is a beautiful account of the conversion of Lydia and her subsequent actions with her whole household who became converted, and her boldness would allow the church to be stable and grow, so much so that it was worthy of a letter by Paul in 62 AD. Paul escapes from jail. He does return to this church in Philippi in order to encourage the brothers before he flees to Thessalonica and beyond. In Corinth, Paul will meet and share residence with a Jewish man named Aquila and his lovely wife, Priscilla, who does so much to be that she's recognized 4 different times by Paul in his letters. And they had left Rome at this time and had recently settled in Corinth because Claudius had ordered the Jews to leave Rome, as we learn in Acts 18. And this couple assists Paul in founding this big church in Corinth and a large fellowship, and then they'll travel with him to Ephesus, discipling many. And the pair are mentioned as co-writers in Paul's subsequent letter to the Corinthian church, and they'll send their own warm greetings in the Lord. Some scholars even assume, and I'll talk about this later, that Priscilla may have co-authored the book of Hebrews, specifically for the Jewish people and other believers who did not know Christ. Additionally, in his letter to the Corinthian church, Paul mentions a certain Chloe. We'll explore her, and her household members have reported to Paul that there's bitter rivalry. And this tone and content of Paul's Corinthian letter comes completely from the report of, quote, Chloe's people, who told about what was going on inside the church at that time. But what would these home churches have looked like? Given the fact that Emperors Nero and Domitian were in power during these crucial first years of the early church and great persecutors of Christians. It wasn't an easy task to follow Jesus and defy the empire that was full of torture and death. And we have to appreciate that there was constant imminent danger. Christians were tortured. They were later lit up as torches. They were dragged to the arena. And yet they still followed. which took a great amount of character. The 16th chapter of Romans will describe and praise three strong women whose efforts propagated the ministry of Paul and the gospel. He will talk about Phoebe, commending our sister Phoebe, who's been a great benefactor of many. Again, greeting Prisca, whom he terms a term of endearment for Priscilla, who risked her own neck for my life, and Junia, outstanding among the apostles. So it's assumed that these women had to also endure persecution and trial. As the church gained strength, women stood out among many of the leaders of faith. This martyrdom era, which we begin to read about in the 100 AD and after church, this was dawning. Women would become martyrs, heroes, as well as apostles and teachers and preachers. In the midst of opposition, women gained names such as these as they continued to offer their homes and hearts and make daring choices. Men were occupied largely in the Roman Forum, with the games, with government, and with the military. They were not interested much in what women were doing at home. Only those who became Christians would take an interest and take part in these home churches, and we'll explore that as we talk about some of the specific women and how they were able to do this alone. An author that I really explored is a woman named Carolyn Osiak, who wrote a delightful book called A Woman's Place, where she really explores these early hidden churches and what that might have looked like for women as Christianity spread. She found that this way of expanding the church became really an alternative life for a Roman woman, so much that it became almost a career for some women, as something that they could do with an absent Roman husband, rather than oversee a house which was largely tended by servants, and many of these women were bored, they were depressed, and Christianity gave them a new lease on life and something that they could feel a part of and grow. Interestingly, as we return to this, we'll explore the fact that an absent Roman husband was actually a way for a woman to use her talent in a better way, and it gave them more license even to become a pivotal force for Christ. Something that I will explore and enjoy talking about is that the early Christian love feast was the Feast of the Eucharist, and we learn about that in many, many manuscripts, historical manuscripts and apocryphal texts. One that's very interesting is known as the Passion of Perpetua and Felicitas. And I explore this a little bit in my book, that it's a well-crafted story that talks about the imprisonment, the trial, and the execution of two Christian women martyred in northern Africa in the church in 203 AD. And the women partake of the last ceremonial meal of bread and wine, and they were celebrating, it's a quote, not a banquet, but a love feast. And they were excited about giving their lives for Christ. The mob warns them of impending judgment, but they stress the joy they anticipate in suffering for the cause of Christ. So these gatherings would be known over time as the Eucharist, from the Greek Eucharista, meaning thankfulness. And it's a beautiful tribute to the bonding of this early church, despite the Caesars that would throw people into the arena. This cup of Christ would embolden believers and give them courage to faithfully walk. So how did these members stay loyal in such attacks? They gathered inside homes where worship took place, they read scripture, and they shared a common cup. They shared stories, tales of courage, and they were banded together with a common purpose. They sponsored the early churches in their homes, and inside their dwellings we can see these painted murals of laughter, tears, conversations, and household journeys. Eventually, the founding apostles would spread, and Peter would settle in Caesarea and later in Rome. Paul would work with Jews and Greeks and plant churches throughout Macedonia. And all of these formed in spite of the watchful eye and equipped people to know what it meant to be a church. They were equipped with a special love that only a mother really has for her unborn child. These people, women and men alike, who carried the early church, had a unique type of love. And in the questions that follow, we'll explore things like, how are you like these different Marys who followed Jesus to the cross? And what was it that gave these women such an ability to offer their homes as places of worship? How did the common cup give them strength to go forward? There will be several questions that we'll answer and dialogue together about, and I'll be happy to answer specific questions about the history in different ways. Thank you for listening, and look forward to next time we'll meet together.